Welcome back to Dead Reckoning, the Human Life Expectancy channel. In our last video, we showed that new pandemics, weapons of mass destruction, and deaths from climate change, the big three as we call them, could cause an estimated 6 million new deaths per year, materially impacting HLE going forward. So how do the risks of natural cataclysms and new technologies and medical advances compare to that? Spoiler alert, we intend to show that even if we wildly overestimate these risks, they're much, much smaller than the big three. So let's start with natural cataclysms. Over the last 20 years, natural disasters have caused about 60,000 deaths on average per year, which is about 1/100th the rate of the big three. This relatively low number is testament to how effectively we humans have insulated ourselves from the dangers of the environment. However, approximately 90% of these deaths occur in developing countries where people are less able to protect themselves. Almost 59% of these deaths are due to earthquakes. Most earthquake deaths are related to building collapses and damage. There's reason to think that in the future, more of these deaths will be prevented as appropriate building codes are more widely used and enforced, and safer homes become widely available. The next three causes, extreme weather, extreme temperature, and floods, account for over 38% of deaths from natural disasters and relate to climate change, which we addressed in our last video, and droughts, landslides, and other disasters make up the remaining 3%. However, there are three natural cataclysms that haven't happened recently, but that could be responsible for many more deaths in the future: large meteor strikes, supervolcanic eruptions, and solar storms. How might these be factored into future HLE estimates? Let's start with meteor strikes. 66 million years ago, the Chicxulub asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, bringing the dinosaurs and the Cretaceous era to an end. 35.7 million years ago, the Papagai asteroid struck Siberia in Russia, causing the Eocene-Oligocene extinction event. Many other smaller meteor strikes also occurred, but because they struck in the oceans or their craters have eroded, it's difficult to determine the average size and frequency of these strikes. In the US, NASA's Planetary Defense Program estimates that there's about 24,000 near-Earth objects, or NEOs, of a size that could cause regional or continental devastation, potentially killing hundreds of millions of people, either from direct impact or subsequent climate change. They expect that the average frequency of these meteor strikes is about once every 12,500 years. However, we're also getting better and better at seeing them coming and developing the ability to change their trajectories to avoid them striking our planet. Nevertheless, for conservatism, we've chosen to take NASA's yearly estimate of 1 in 12,500 and apply it to a roughly estimated 100 million average deaths to arrive at an average estimate of about 8,000 deaths per year going forward. Also, in the history of our planet, supervolcanoes have killed millions of people and driven many species to extinction. The eruption of the Toba supervolcano reduced the human population to only about 1,000 or so people in 70,000 BC. The last supervolcanic eruption was the Aruanui eruption of New Zealand's Taupo volcano 26,500 years ago. At least 60 supervolcanic eruptions have been identified so far. One recent study estimated that supervolcanic eruptions occur every 17,000 years on average, a very small yearly probability. Also, today it's almost certain that we would have significant warning prior to a massive eruption. Before supervolcano eruptions, underground magma reservoirs take years to decades to fill, causing easily detectable changes, such as great uplift in the Earth's crust, earthquakes, and new areas of steam and heat and gas. This would likely provide ample time for people to move away from the eruption and ashfall zones, to move to suitable locations, and time to stockpile food and cultivate new food sources that are less dependent on sunlight. For example, mushrooms, insects, and bacteria. Solar storms also have the potential to impact HLE. Solar storms are disturbances on the sun which can emanate outward across space, affecting the entire solar system, including Earth and its magnetosphere. They include solar flares, which are large explosions in the sun's atmosphere, and coronal mass ejections, or CMEs, which are massive bursts of solar wind. Solar flares consist of radiation in all bands of the electromagnetic spectrum, and therefore they travel at the speed of light, so they reach us about 8 minutes after they leave the sun. CME particles travel much more slowly than solar flares and take several days to reach the Earth from the sun, but they can be far more damaging. The intense magnetic fields associated with CMEs induce strong electric currents around wires, pipes, and other conductors, and the longer the wire, the greater the amplification. This can cause voltage collapse, or worse, cause permanent damage to large transformers. The largest recorded geomagnetic perturbation, resulting presumably from a CME hitting the Earth's magnetosphere, was the Carrington Event of 1859. Which took down parts of the recently created U.S. telegraph network, starting fires and giving some telegraph operators electric shocks. However, this event wasn't reported to cause even a single human death. So how might solar storms impact HLE going forward? According to a report published in 2012 by physicist Pete Riley of Predictive Science, Inc., the chance of Earth being hit by a Carrington-class storm between 2012 and 2022 is 12%. Another study published in 2019 found that on average there's a 0.7% chance of a Carrington-class storm per year. A similar storm might cause more fatalities today. Our societies are much more dependent upon digital technology for our safety, communication, energy, and sustenance than they were in the past. A similar or larger solar storm would almost certainly knock out satellites, power grids, and the internet, proving far more deadly. One recent study estimates the economic cost of such a storm in the U.S. alone amounts to $7.2 billion per day, which makes these events well worth studying, preventing, and preparing for. In the longer term, this is a significant risk. The Earth's magnetosphere, which protects us and all of Earth's creatures from solar flares and radiation, is changing quickly. Over millennia, irrefutable geologic evidence proves that the Earth's north and south poles have flipped many times, reducing our planet's natural magnetic defenses against solar storms. According to scientists' best estimates, the field is now losing approximately 5% of its strength every decade and may be due for a flip. Currently, the magnetic pole is moving at a breakneck speed of 55 kilometers per year, and the Earth's magnetic field is weakened by over 35% in the last 2,000 years, shrinking the planet's protective magnetic bubble. At the same time, we are placing ever more reliance on satellites and electronic equipment in outer space that's less and less shielded from solar flares, posing a critical risk to our societies and our survival. In the extreme, a large CME could overwhelm the Earth's magnetic field, blow our atmosphere off the planet, causing extinction of all or virtually all life on Earth. Still, since the most serious event took place over 160 years ago and was not responsible for a single human death, for conservatism, we've chosen to reflect an average of 2,000 deaths per year going forward in our estimates of HLE. Let's now estimate the deaths driven by new technologies. The new technologies we presented in our technology videos each have the potential to materially increase human life expectancy. However, some also create the opportunity for new ways to die, which we need to consider. Some non-medical technologies, such as clean water, new food, and new transportation technologies, would likely require additional energy. So, for example, to fuel desalination plants, to control the environments in vertical farms, to make new turbines and solar cells for wind and solar energy, and to produce driverless cars. And this energy could drive climate change, shortening HLE, as we discussed in our last video. However, these, as well as current deaths from water, food, and transportation technologies, are already accounted for in the current HLE estimates, so they seem to offer little opportunity for new ways to die. Under IT, smartphones, sensors, bionics, and medical imaging currently all require energy and rare earth metals, which can be dangerous to mine and cause pollution. But these are also included in current death statistics. In addition, sensors for people and machines can be hacked, potentially causing damage or even death. While there have been high-profile cases of people that have hacked into sensors in individual pacemakers and autonomous car programs, and while one could imagine hacking into them to cause harm, it's difficult to imagine this happening at any scale that would even begin to counteract the increased human life expectancy that these technologies create. Nevertheless, to achieve our objective of avoiding overstating the potential improvements in HLE, we chose to assume that an average of 100 people die this way each year going forward. On the other hand, sensors and controls that are used in machines, utilities, and mass transportation, often referred to as the Internet of Things, IoT, they might present a more substantial risk. What if terrorists seized control of air traffic control, as they did in the 1988 film Die Hard? Or maliciously flipped railway switches, causing enormous derailments and crashes? What if they caused lengthy electricity blackouts, resulting in mayhem, or even caused a nuclear energy plant to melt down? To roughly estimate these risks, let's attempt to quantify the impact on HLE from an IoT attack resulting in the meltdown of a nuclear reactor, from terrorist activities, or from human error, as was the case at the 1986 meltdown of Russia's plant in Chernobyl, or even a natural disaster, as was the case of the 2011 meltdown of Japan's Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactor. While the results of these disasters were horrific, neither had a significant impact on global human life expectancy. Chernobyl caused 54 short-term deaths, and studies have predicted perhaps another 4,000 people might eventually die as a result of radiation exposure. In Japan, there were no deaths from acute radiation syndrome at Fukushima, and studies have predicted anywhere between 0 to hundreds of deaths from accumulated radiation exposure. Nuclear technology is also evolving to make it less prone to meltdowns. Chernobyl and Fukushima were both Generation 2 reactors, which were built between 1965 and 1996. Now, Generation 3 reactors are used, which have improved fuel technology, superior thermal efficiency, significantly enhanced safety systems, including passive nuclear safety, and standardized designs for reduced maintenance and capital costs. Generation 4 plants, which are being developed, incorporate a sustainable closed fuel cycle for the reactor, such as a molten salt reactor, which further enhances safety. So together, the Chernobyl and Fukushima meltdowns accounted for up to 5,000 deaths in the long term. As a result, for conservatism, we chose to assume 2,000 people die yearly from this risk. This effectively assumes that across IoT technologies, a Chernobyl-level event takes place every other year, which is many times more than the historical rate. Let's now roughly estimate the potential new deaths from bionics and cyborgs. The main risk to life expectancy from bionics might arise from the culture wars, as people that have been enhanced with bionics or cybernetic capabilities experience conflict with those who have not. This is the central storyline behind the popular X-Men superhero films, based on the Marvel Comics superhero team of the same name, except based on bionics instead of the genetic mutations, as in the case of the movie. Because we're self-interested beings, those with new physical or mental capabilities will be tempted to use them for their individual advantage over those that don't have them. Also, unlike those who have undergone genetic engineering, many people who undergo bionic or cybernetic enhancements will be readily identifiable. This visible increase in human diversity could result in greater conflict between people that have been cybernetically enhanced and those that have not. Also, unlike genetic engineering, bionic and cybernetic enhancement may be even more expensive and less evenly distributed across the global population. This might engender conflict between those that have and, again, those that have not. To roughly estimate this risk, we first need to note that we generally do not see wars resulting in death between people with different levels of physical or mental capabilities. No wars of the handicapped versus those that are not. No wars, yet at least, between people of different IQs or different scores on other standardized tests. This, together with the relatively embryonic stage that bionics and cybernetics are in today, make us think that such deaths will be small or non-existent in the next 20 years. Still, for conservatism, we could compare this to the impact on HLE from much greater conflicts. Arguably, one of the largest and most intractable conflicts on the planet has been the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. From 1860 to today, it's claimed an average of 700 lives a year. Again, to quantify the relative size of this risk, for conservatism, we chose to round this up to assume that 1,000 people per year die in cyborg-human conflict. What additional deaths could come from machine learning or artificial intelligence, AI? Perhaps offsetting some of the benefits of AI might be several ways that it might reduce human life expectancy. There's been much attention given to the possibility that AI could gain superintelligence and decide to harm humans. However, thorough, fact-based analysis indicates that we'll be likely to control this technology as it develops. Check out Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom for a scholarly, thought-provoking analysis of these possibilities. Rather than AI rising to attack us, it's much more likely that it will either intentionally or unintentionally be used by people to cause harm. Centralized control of AI and data could lead to negligent or nefarious use of AI to control people's behavior. On the unintentional side, it's been shown that AI algorithms that were developed based on historical information to identify images, sort through job applications, and complete simple tasks can inadvertently promote historical biases, institutional racism, and discrimination, and violate human rights. On the intentional side, the world has witnessed how recommendation algorithms on social media can be used to help spread misinformation and fake news and upend the US's 2016 presidential elections. This could even get worse as deep fakes use HI to modify videos in ways that make it very difficult for viewers to recognize that they've been tampered with. It could also result in increasing risk of single-point failure with large potential consequences. In the extreme, one could imagine a society in which one central AI took care of the needs of the entire population. In that situation, if that AI were to fail suddenly, the population might not be able to meet its needs. This was explored in Season 1, Episode 16 of the TV series Star Trek New Generation, which was entitled When the Bow Breaks. So, how might we quantify the risks for machine learning and AI? The possibility of AI intentionally or unintentionally causing harm is difficult to quantify because it requires linking the ways that AI might change our thoughts to how it might change our behaviors. On one hand, thoughts are not actions, and free speech must be protected. On the other hand, manipulating opinions through fake news, deep fakes, and other malicious AI can cause violence and bring countries, especially democracies, to their knees. At least 114 Americans were killed in riots and political protests around the 2020 presidential election, including the January 6 attack on the Capitol itself, and many more could have perished. But even then, humans have always sought to manipulate the thoughts of others, and it's not right to attribute this solely to AI. We'll talk much more about this in our video on advancing the evolution of ideas. But for now, with a lack of solid estimates for use, for conservatism, we've chosen to overestimate this risk and assume that 2,000 people die a year from this cause. Again, roughly a Chernobyl-level event every 2 years. Nanotechnology might also be responsible for new deaths going forward. A nightmare scenario involving nanotechnology is that out-of-control bots might consume all the biomass on Earth to reproduce themselves, killing us all and ultimately resulting in a universe of, quote, gray goo. Macroscopic self-replicating machines were originally described by mathematician John von Neumann. However, the nanotechnology pioneer K. Eric Drexler, who coined the term gray goo in his 1986 book The Engines of Creation, said in 2004, quote, "I wish I had never used the term gray goo." He more recently conceded that there's no need to build anything that even resembles a potential runaway replicator, making this risk very low. Also, there's many things we could do to mediate these risks from technologies, including continually testing new infrastructure, power, and water to ensure their safety against attack, increasing transparency of the sources of information and whether AI has been involved, ensuring healthy levels of transparency, redundancy, and contingency plans should critical AI fail. Still, despite the fact that no one's yet demonstrated that this threat will become real, for conservatism, we've chosen to overestimate this risk and assume that 2,000 people die a year from this cause. Again, roughly a Chernobyl-level event every 2 years. Let's now consider what additional deaths might be caused by reading the genome, genetic engineering, stem cell therapies, and other new medical advances. So note, if you haven't seen our videos on these new technologies yet, you might want to view them first to learn more about these life-saving and extending technologies. In this video, we're only going to cover their potential negative impacts on HLE. Merely reading the genome and the epigenome and applying them to predictive medicine are extremely unlikely to create new ways to die and result in reduced human life expectancy. One possibility would be if the tests were performed incorrectly, leading to improper diagnoses and treatments. However, this risk exists for any medical diagnoses and medical protocols, including approving tests based on their sensitivity and specificity in peer-reviewed studies, are in place to ensure that this likelihood is minimal. As a result, we chose not to reflect any additional reductions in HLE from genetic and epigenetic testing. Genetic engineering and stem cell therapies have a greater prospect to have negative impacts as well as positive impacts on human life expectancy. In addition to the biological weapons of mass destruction we've already discussed, genetic engineering offers the horrific prospect of targeting people by their genome. Combined with gene-drive technologies, this could theoretically lead to an unprecedented genocide. But hold on. To cause the death of any individual, any such nefariously altered cells would have to be delivered to his or her body. The easiest way to do that would be to use a hypodermic needle, which would make it a much slower, less effective, and more expensive means of causing death than injecting someone with any number of poisons that are available today, which would cause immediate death. It would also take at least 2 decades for the first offspring of those affected to pass it to their children, and 4 or more decades for it to have an effect on the population. This would allow plenty of time for someone to discover what had happened and remediate the affected genomes. So, by comparison, such genetically altered cells would hardly be an effective murder weapon. So how might we quantify the potential risk from genetic engineering? The case of Jesse Gelsinger is a relevant point of comparison. Mr. Gelsinger suffered from a rare genetic disorder called ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency syndrome, or OTCD, in which ammonia builds up to lethal levels in the blood. In 1999, he underwent a genetic treatment developed by researchers at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia to fix the OTC gene, which produces an enzyme that prevents ammonia buildup. Unlike 18 patients that had received the treatment before him, Jesse soon began to show severe symptoms, and within 4 days, he had died. As a result, biochemist Jennifer Doudna, who later discovered the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing mechanism, remembers feeling the shockwave as the young researcher, even though her work had nothing to do with gene therapy or anything of the kind, she said, quote, "We're all very much aware of what happened and what that tragedy that was. And, quote, that made the whole field of gene therapy go away mostly for at least a decade," unquote. This delay may well have cost hundreds or thousands of lives that might have been saved had genetic engineering continued to advance during that period. Still, for conservatism, we chose to reflect this risk by assuming 10 deaths per year, again far more than Jesse Gelsinger's single death in a single year, in our forecasts of HLE. Blood augmentation and HLE-enhancing pharmaceuticals might also have unintended consequences that might have negative impacts on HLE. One hopefully over-conservative point of comparison might be what was known as the thalidomide tragedy. In 1957, the sedative called thalidomide was introduced to the German market, and in 1960 it was marketed in 46 countries with sales rivaling the sales of aspirin. However, in 1961, doctors began to associate it with phocomelia as a side effect of the drug thalidomide, resulting in the shortening or absence of limbs in children born to women taking the drug. In 1962, it was banned from multiple countries, but not before causing hundreds of children to be born with significant deformities. This tragedy catalyzed the beginnings of the rigorous drug approval and monitoring systems in place in the United States Food and Drug Administration, FDA, today. As a result, genetic and other medical and pharmaceutical treatments today are less likely to cause such problems. And, as horrific as this tragedy was, it did not result in a single death. Nevertheless, for our rough, conservative estimate, we chose to reflect this by assuming 10 deaths per year in our calculations of HLE. Theoretically, hyperbaric oxygen therapy might also result in a few unintended yearly deaths. Perhaps human error or mechanical failure could cause a small number of people to contract the bends, also known as decompression sickness. As unlikely as this is to happen in a highly controlled medical environment, we chose to reflect this risk by assuming 10 deaths per year in our calculations of HLE. Organ creation, cryonics, and digital consciousness have little to no prospect for creating new ways to die. New technologies only make organs more available to those that need them and reduce their chances of rejection, and the technology of digital consciousness involves no direct treatment of living humans. So now we can return to the question we raised at the top of this video. How do the risks of natural cataclysms and new technologies and medical advances compare to the big three risks of new pandemics, weapons of mass destruction, and climate change, as we covered in our last video? First, recall from our video, Will We Live Longer?, that since 1900, less than 1/1000th of the time that Homo sapiens has existed, we've increased the global human population by more than 6 times and more than doubled global HLE. Global HLE advanced an average of 4 months per year during this period. Mortality risk is predicted to continue to its long decline, and new ways to perish, even as overestimated here and in our previous video, are likely to be no more than approximately 1/10 the risks that we die from today. In our last video, we found that together, new pandemics, weapons of mass destruction, and climate change could result in over 6 million deaths per year going forward. The numbers in this video are much smaller. We found that yearly deaths from natural cataclysms and new technologies, even at their overly represented values in this video, are about 10,000 yearly deaths. About 1/600th the risk of the big three. So 99.7% of new deaths will likely be from naturally occurring diseases, nuclear and biological weapons that have existed for decades, and climate change, and only 0.15% of new deaths are likely to be from meteor strikes, supervolcano eruptions, and solar storms that haven't occurred recently. And the remaining 0.15% could be from new digital and medical technologies. This factor of 600 is highly material. As a point of comparison, if mosquitoes were 600 times larger, they'd be 15 feet long with wingspans of almost 20 feet. Presumably you'd agree that would matter. When we look at just the additional potential deaths from genetic and epigenetic testing and engineering, stem cell work, and other promising life-extending medical advancements, as overestimated in this video, we came up with just 30 additional yearly deaths. That means that the additional risk from dying from these new medical advances is 300 times smaller than even the smaller risks of perishing from new technologies. Carrying our mosquito analogy further, comparing deaths from these medical advances to deaths from new pandemics, weapons of mass destruction, and climate change is like comparing a mosquito to a flying behemoth almost a mile long. Deaths from medical advances are vanishingly small by comparison. So, while there is a non-zero risk associated with new digital and medical technologies, they are so small compared to other new causes of death that the estimates would have to be wrong by a factor of hundreds to thousands for these risks to be even roughly equivalent. Even more so when compared to the millions of lives that could be saved or extended each year by new technologies and medical advances, the argument for their continued development and deployment becomes even stronger. The lives that could be saved and extended by new technologies are so much greater that we should continue their development apace and slow them only at the peril of sentencing many thousands of people to premature death. That's what our numbers say, and again, we wholeheartedly invite you to help us to refine them with better and better information over time. However, in our next video, we'll also explore basic ethical perspectives that should also guide our use of new technologies. In the meantime, please hit the like button below, subscribe to the Human Life Expectancy channel to make sure you don't miss our next videos, and post comments for the topics you'd like to have us cover. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, as we say at Human Life Expectancy, Hi Hua! Do what you can to help yourself and help us all to live longer.